leaving 40 minutes for Eric. And there were two items that we didn't clarify or get to last time. The first concerned several people, you in particular, had raised a question about who authorizes U.S. use of nuclear weapons. So, as I mentioned, the U.S. president is the sole authority to authorize the use. Now, there is something called the National Command Authority, and it does involve his consultation, his or her consultation, with the Secretary of Defense. But the Secretary of Defense cannot veto the President's decision to authorize use. The Secretary of Defense can concur with the President's decision to authorize use. And if the Secretary of Defense does differ in his views or her views from the President can terminate the Secretary of Defense and get another Secretary of Defense who will agree with the President. There is an interesting incident that occurred in 1974. This was not in when Nixon was under threat because of the Watergate crisis, which ultimately led to his removal, his resignation in August '74. He went through what some people later described as some sort of mental breakdown. And he also was an alcoholic who was drinking very heavily. And he began to talk to the paintings in the hallways of the Oval Office looking for advice. So this got back to the senior cabinet members that they were very alarmed, in part over this reason, that he had sole authority to authorize nuclear weapon use. So in a very controversial move, it was only later revealed that Schlesinger, who was Secretary of Defense, notified senior staff and notified the Strategic Air Command that they were not to employ nuclear weapon use without checking with him. Now, what would have actually happened if Nixon had authorized the attack on the Soviet Union? And then Schlesinger sought to countermand it, which is contrary to American law. I have no idea, but that was one really precarious case there. And of course, currently, there's interesting speculation, what would happen if Trump authorized use, which he has every right to do. So that's the dicey current situation on authorized use of U.S. nuclear weapons. What the Soviet system, Russian system is, I don't know. I presume it's Putin. Whether he has to get any co-approval from the Chief of the General Staff or somebody else, I don't know. So any questions about that? It's a very important subject. There's a whole issue of the command and control of nuclear weapons. And there's a good book by Scott Sagan from Stanford on this subject. And also, there are several other books and key articles about the command and control system and concern about unauthorized use or unauthorized or accidental use of nuclear weapons. So this is a non-trivial matter. Okay. The other point is on containment, which I didn't get to last time. So when we discussed the different elements of deterrence, we did that because deterrence was elevated to a subject of national policy in the Cold War nuclear weapons world. Deterrence has always been a factor in military strategy. And there's a fine book by George Quester, a former professor at Maryland, called Deterrence Before Hiroshima. To say it didn't start with nuclear weapons, it started way before, which is to convey a threat, if then, all the elements that we discussed. But under the US national security strategy in the Cold War era, nuclear deterrence became a national policy. And that became a key element of how the US thought about strategy against Soviet Union during the Cold War. The other key element of U.S. strategy during the Cold War was containment. And that was authored initially by George Kennan. Kennan had been the Deputy Chief of Mission, DCM, in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow during the war, 1944 to 1946. And he soaked up a lot of understanding of how the Soviet Union was working under Stalin. This was not an experience that many other Americans had. And he felt that the Soviet Union under Stalin was inherently expansionist and needed to be contained. And because it was a very sensitive matter, he authored an anonymous article, he didn't put his name on it, called Sources of Soviet Conduct in Foreign Affairs magazine in July 1947. And he labeled his own authorship X. Is the famous X article, Sources of Soviet Conduct, Foreign Affairs, July 47. And the most pregnant phrase in that article is, the United States policy must be that of a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. And what he claimed was, because they were inherently expansionist, if they were frustrated in their expansion, they would ultimately evolve and change their form of government. So this was a way to not only thwart them internationally, but to change them domestically. This was Kennan's core idea. Now, a problem with it was it wasn't spelled out in a lot of detail. So some interpreted the phrase firm and vigilant containment as mean primarily military, which was not Kennan's idea. He talked about economic, social, political, psychological, as well as military attributes. And it was ironic because a man who became very prominent in the Defense Department and both during the Truman years and then much later on was Paul Nitze, N-I-T-Z-E. This is one of the most famous strategists and arms controllers of the last 50 years. And Nitze very much relied on the military element of containment. He didn't question containment, but he said it's largely about military matters. And he and Kennan got into a huge fight as to what Kennan's containment policy really meant. Mm-hmm. Nitze was disagreeing with Kennan about Kennan's own idea. And it got so bad that ultimately Nitze argued to the Secretary of State in the second Truman term, Dean Acheson, that Acheson should fire Kennan, that Kennan was obstructionist in the implementation of his own policy. And Acheson agreed. So Kennan was fired. This bizarre circumstance. And over the next 50 years, and now into the 21st century, there has been a very spirited debate about what are the key elements of containment, when is it appropriate, when isn't it, when is it successful, when isn't it. For example, the whole Vietnam War was justified on the grounds of containing Soviet communist influence, when in fact it was largely a civil war involving North Vietnamese communists and South Vietnamese, which was a corrupt government. So, and we talk now about containing Iranian influence in the Middle East. So the containment policy has survived decades since Kennan first wrote about it, and it's been applied to others besides the Soviet Union and Russia. It's become a core element of U.S. National security policy, as has deterrence. Those two key concepts have been sort of the lodestar for American policy, irrespective of the administration, with the possible exception of this administration, because the jury's still out, and it's so unclear because you have a president who seems to be at odds with most members of his own administration about what U.S. policy is. So we'll talk about Trump a little bit later, but that's a separate problem. So any questions about those two concepts? I want to make sure it's understood. It's discussed in the book, but it's not given enormous attention. Containment and deterrence. Okay. So now I want to get into what happened with the evolution of the U.S. nuclear stockpile and strategy as the Cold War progressed. And of course, there was this big argument about whether we should have thermonuclear weapons. We discussed that. Teller was the big supporter of them. Oppenheimer was the big opponent. There was this very dramatic Oppenheimer security hearing where Teller argued against giving them a security clearance. Oppenheimer was denied the clearance and never again advised the government at the highest levels. He was a great hero in the scientific community, but not in governmental circles. And under Teller and Harold Brown, who ran the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, the U.S. built and stockpiled and then deployed thermonuclear weapons on a variety of delivery vehicles. But for the most part, in the 50s and into the 60s in particular, the emphasis was less on the warheads and more on the delivery vehicles, the means by which these weapons would be sent to their targets. And the U.S. has had, for decades now, since the 60s, a triad, a three-pronged nuclear force. The oldest, and in some ways maybe the most reliable, are the long-range bombers, the first of which was the B-29 that delivered the weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the 60s, the B-29 was replaced by the B-52, and the B-52 has gone through A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 8 different modernization phases. There's now the B-52H that still is in existence. 1960 to, it's 40 and 59 years since it was first deployed. There are questions about its reliability and its penetrability. The issue with the bomber is can it get through the air defenses to reach its target? The bombers are based in the hinterland inside the central United States. There is a new long-range bomber now in the planning stages, the B-21, that will replace the B-52. It's a few years away from being developed and deployed. So and Suk has given you photographs of the B-29 Superfortress, the B-52 Stratofortress, and the B-21 Raider, which also, I think, because of its strange shape, it's a stealth aircraft, which means it's not identifiable by normal radar. So that's one leg of the U.S. triad. The second leg are intercontinental ballistic missiles. So an intercontinental ballistic missile is a multi-stage missile where the first and second stages burn their fuel out, and then the third stage pushes a reentry vehicle into orbit. And the orbit flies through a ballistic trajectory. So you have stage 1 and stage 2, and they burn out. And then stage 3, the RV, goes through a parabolic trajectory to its target. This is the reentry vehicle here, the RV. The reentry vehicle is just a metal housing that houses the warheads. It can house one warhead, 2 warheads, or multiple warheads. Uh, The U.S. Main ICBM of recent times has been the Minuteman, which is a solid-fueled ICBM. It's land-based. It's put in hardened underground silos. Hardened so it can resist nuclear blast. The ICBM would be a natural target, high-priority target for any attacker. And it involves a two-key system. I had the opportunity to visit ICBM Command Center. This was in the Dakotas. Big bus for miles and miles. It's flat as a pancake. And suddenly there's a gate. And you get out of the bus, and in the gate there's Marine guards everywhere. There are no population, there's no birds, there's no flowers, there's nothing. It's just barren territory. How many of you have actually been to an ICBM?
Oh.
You have. You've been to?
I went to Dakotas.
Oh, okay, okay. And then you go into a shed, you know, a small like wooden shed. And in the shed is an elevator. And it looks like one of these giant elevators like in a bank. That, you know, it has huge metal doors. Take the elevator down, and when you get out of the elevator, there's this even larger metal door, and that is the entryway into the control center. And there are Marine guards there. And then you go into the control center, and there are two control panels with two individuals, two seats, a distance apart, sufficient distance that they can't grab each other. And these are young men and women, Air Force officers, usually in their early 20s. And they are given codes authorizing them to launch the ICBM. And the codes have to match. There's a whole system of how they have to coordinate. That's called the two-key system. There's never been a launch of the US ICBM in anger, ever. But you can imagine the tension of that kind of job. A young person, yes.
Are the underground silos the same or different than the Nike missile silos?
A Nike missile or old missiles, they don't exist anymore.
Okay, so those are all empty. Those silos are all empty, yeah.
They've been filled up or filled over. Yeah, new silos have been created, much more modern silos. A lot of attention has been given to the construction of silos that can resist a direct nuclear attack. It's much more sophisticated than it was 50, 60 years ago when the Nike. And the Nike Zeus was a missile defense system, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Yes? No, there are no Titan IIs left in the arsenal. Could look that up. They were large, I think even some of them were liquid-fueled ICBMs. I think the liquid-fueled ICBMs have phased out. Liquid-fueled ICBMs were viewed as much less reliable than solid-fuel ICBMs. So the ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, is the second leg of the triad. The third leg are submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, on-board nuclear-powered submarines, the acronym for which is SSBN, Subsurface Ballistic Nuclear. So SLBMs are deployed on SSBNs. Got it? And the first deployment in the early 60s under McNamara were 41 SSBNs with 10 missiles each. Now, these are submarines that patrol in millions of miles of open ocean area. So they are the least vulnerable to attack. But the silos are sitting in point targets, underground targets. Whether the U.S. has never deployed mobile ICBMs, which is not true of the Russians and the Chinese. Russians and Chinese have deployed mobile ICBM that move around on railway cars or another way. The U.S. has decided it gets complicated. It involves possibly political opposition in communities. It's not worth the while. So, but mobility and hardness are two of the key defenses of of land-based systems against attack. So the SLBM on board the SSBM is considered the least vulnerable to attack of the three legs of the triad. Now, then along in the 60s came another innovation. The RAND Corporation began to look into what could be done with the reentry vehicle. First, the idea was to put more than one warhead in a reentry vehicle, and RAND helped design multiple warhead reentry vehicles, and they became MRVs, multiple reentry vehicles. Then the more important technological development was multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, MIRVs. So an MIRV would release multiple warheads that could either attack a single target or they could attack multiple targets. And there's an analytical formula for this called single shot kill probability, SSKP. It's listed on my outline there. I'm not going to get into the single shot kill probability calculation, but what it shows is you have much higher kill probability if you have more than one warhead from an MIRV on a single target. A problem with MIRVs, yes?
Does the submarine have to surface in order to?
No, the submarine does not have to surface. That's with the SLBMs. Now, another thing I didn't mention here, is it on the next page or not? No, it's not. I should have mentioned here, in addition, this is Roman numeral 2. We go to the next slide. Yeah, on that slide should also have been cruise missiles. Whereas the ballistic missile is powered in flight, except for the third stage, which uses gravitational force to follow a ballistic trajectory to its target. So it's initially powered and then it's gravitational. The cruise missile is fully powered in flight. The cruise missiles are small, they're like 20 feet long. They weigh a few thousand pounds, and they can be either ground launched, air launched, or sea launched. Ground launched are Glickums, sea launched are Slickums, air launched are Alcums. The B-52, and soon will be the B-21, will carry Alcums. The submarines carry Slickums. And several recent wars that the U.S. has been in, even let's say like the first Middle East war, when the U.S. attacked Iraq for invading Kuwait in 1991, the initial phase of the war was the use of submarine-based Slickums attacking the command and control of the Iraqi military.
We used the Nikon for the initial attack on that.
I'm sorry?
I thought we unveiled our stealth tech for the original attack on Baghdad. We used the Nikon, which was an air attack.
We could check it. I don't believe so. The very initial attack was using Slickums. And the U.S. did use stealth systems in a variety of ways. That's the first time we revealed our stealth technology during that war. What I was going to mention, and bullet on the fratricide, is that a problem that arose in the testing of the MIRVs is that sometimes the MIRVs could knock into each other. So fratricide is killing of one's brother. So one multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle, instead of killing the target, killed the other multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle. So this has become a big issue in designing the MIRVs properly. And MIRV technology is now, the Soviets have a lot of MIRV technology. Chinese, to my knowledge, have still never tested MIRVs. We go back to the previous slide. Yeah, besides the MIRVs, the latest advance in reentry vehicle technology are MARVs, maneuverable reentry vehicles. These are reentry vehicles that don't have a gravitational trajectory. They can move around. It also reduces the fratricide problem. The U.S. has tested MARVs. I don't believe we've deployed them. And you see examples of the MIRV technology, of the nose cones, of the warheads to the right there. So when the McNamara's main thesis was that the nuclear balance was not about counter cities and city busting and killing millions of people. It was about counter force capabilities of the two sides, the ability of each side to destroy the other side's forces. And he argued that if the US had the capability to assure the destruction of some hypothetical percentage of the US, of the Soviet population and of its nuclear forces, that would be enough, after the first strike, that would be enough to deter the Soviet Union. He's looking for the criteria for credible retaliatory capability against the Soviet Union. That was the whole point of the nuclear strategy. So assured destruction was the nuclear declaratory policy, and the triad was the way to get assured destruction. Any questions about this? Okay, then quickly on defenses. Warfare is about measures, countermeasures, countermeasures. That's the name of the game. So you have bombers you want to defend against. You want to reduce their penetrability, and you reduce their penetrability by having air defenses that can knock them down. There's been a whole history of air defenses. I'm going to skip over that. Missile defense has been a much more prominent field. And in the 1960s, the Soviets were the first to deploy a missile defense system around Moscow to protect their national capital. The US had a safeguard system and a sentinel system in the 60s also that would defend against Washington, and would defend some of our own missile silos. In the late 60s, McNamara came to the view that defenses could be destabilizing. Now, what do you mean by that? I said, supposing you and I both have large numbers of offensive forces, and now supposing I'm building defenses to protect my offensive forces against attack. And I'm saying I'm just doing this to be defensive so I don't get hurt if you attack me. You could say, no, you're building defenses in preparation for a first strike against me, with the defenses being used to defend against a retaliatory attack. So this became a central thesis of McNamara, and new in the development of nuclear strategy, the destabilizing effects of defensive systems. And in 1967, there was a major summit meeting that President Johnson had. Kennedy had died in 63, Johnson was president. McNamara was still Secretary of Defense. And they met the Soviet leader. Now, the top Soviet leader was Brezhnev, who replaced Khrushchev. Brezhnev chose not to go to this meeting, but his second in command was Kosygin. So Kosygin went to the meeting. The meeting was in Glassboro, New Jersey, an odd place for a summit meeting. Glassboro, New Jersey, the Glassboro Summit. And it goes down in history as this is when McNamara gave a tutorial to Kosygin on the destabilizing effects of defenses, to which Kosygin was trying to look, we lost 20 million people in the Second World War. There are no amount of defenses that are enough for us. He rejected the idea. McNamara said, we'll send you some books. You'll learn about it. He really did it in a like professor to the student kind of way. But ultimately, there was enough interest on the part of the Soviet Union that it led to the first arms control negotiation between the US and the Soviet Union. The SALT negotiation, S-A-L-T, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And that led, that's much further down. That led to the SALT I agreements in 1972. This is the first nuclear arms agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nixon was president. Kissinger was the key figure as the national security advisor. And it had two parts, SALT I had two parts, an interim offensive agreement to limit the number of weapons. It didn't get rid of weapons. It was not disarmament, it was arms control. Big distinction there. And the other feature of the SALT I agreement was the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited missile defenses to two sites, the national capital and one missile silo in the hinterland. SALT became a world-famous agreement. When Nixon went to Moscow to sign the SALT agreement, the headlines in the newspapers were like this. It was a global consequence that somehow we're going to grab a hold of the nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, however, there's a lot to how we got to SALT, and I'm only going to have 5 minutes to discuss a little of that. So let's go, yes, let's go back. Yes, right there. So there's an important differentiation between disarmament and arms control. Disarmament is when you get rid of the weapons. Arms control is when you control existing deployments, you limit them. You limit the deployment of weapons, but you don't get rid of them. The initial idea in the US government goes back to the 40s, right after the war. Should all these weapons be destroyed? And should they be put under international control? There was a major report in the US government written by Atchison, who was not yet Secretary of State, and he was another Secretary of State at the time, and David Lilienthal, who was chairman of the new Atomic Energy Commission. The Atchison-Lilienthal report laid out a framework in which all nuclear weapons would be controlled internationally through some international bodies. The U.S. would give up its sovereign control of its own nuclear weapons. The Atchison-Lilienthal report morphed into something called the Baruch Plan. Bernard Baruch was a Wall Street financier who was named by Truman to be the man at the United Nations to propose this plan. It became the Baruch Plan. And there's a lot of historical writing on this, whether this was really a genuine American proposal or not. Didn't we think that the Soviets would veto the idea? And we thought they'd veto it because if this was a time, 1946, we had nuclear weapons, they did not have nuclear weapons. So this would freeze the Soviets out of their nuclear capability. Now, I think you know, the UN was set up with a Security Council that has 5 permanent members: US, Britain, France, China, Russia. And those 5 permanent members have a veto power over any issue. So the Security Council was given the concept of the group plan. The US, France, and Britain supported it. And I think China did too. China was Taiwan at the time. The Soviets vetoed it. So that killed the idea. So that was the first and last effort for international removal of nuclear weapons. Later on, in the 50s, there was some treaties. There was the Antarctic Treaty and a couple of other treaties. So the Antarctic Treaty was a statement saying, this is an area of the world where there will not be any nuclear weapons. You can't deploy them anywhere. And Antarctic was one place where the US military and the Soviet military had no plans at that time to deploy them, so it was easy to get an agreement. I'm skipping over a lot of interesting history. I can give you references on this for those of you. In 1960, there was a largely academic meeting held in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the concept of arms control. If disarmament was too difficult, too hard, was there a better way to get a handle on this US-Soviet nuclear competition? And a key product of that meeting was a small book by Tom Schelling and Mort Halpern. Tom Schelling later won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on strategy, and Mort Halpern became a figure in the Nixon administration and has been a strategist all his life. They wrote this book, Strategy and Arms Control, in which they said arms control is any measure that reduces the likelihood of war, reduces the damage should war occur, and reduces the cost for the preparation of war. Those 3 criteria. I hope you're getting this. If not, your call. Arms control, reduce the likelihood of war, reduce the damage should war occur, and reduce the resources devoted to war. And that became a central concept of arms control in US nuclear strategy with the Soviet Union. Later on, and this is my final word, under John Kennedy, there had been in 1962 the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a very dangerous situation. I think we discussed this. Did I discuss this with how my class was meeting? I didn't. I'll give you 30 seconds on this. I was an engineering student in 1962 in college, and I had an electrical exam on a Thursday. And on Monday, Kennedy told the world that there were Soviet missiles in Cuba, and he said any missile fired from Cuba on anywhere in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, necessitating an American counterstrike against the Soviet Union. It was quite a terrifying time. When I went to class on Tuesday, the professor said, you know, we have an exam scheduled on Thursday. I'm going to postpone it because I don't think I'll be alive to grade the exam questions. It was absolutely terrifying time. We were like right on the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, right on the edge. There was a quarantine blockade. I assume you're familiar with it. Some of you, how many of you are not familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Not familiar with it. You all are familiar. Okay. Very good book by Graham Allison, Essence of Decision. Gives you all the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So one thing after that crisis, Kennedy, the US president, was so concerned that we could slip into nuclear war with the Soviet Union. They said we have to do something to try to control these weapons. And that led to the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963. So if I find the point. So that limited limited nuclear testing only to underground tests. It couldn't be in the atmosphere, it couldn't be in space, it couldn't be on the sea, it could only be underground. And he proposed that because the Joint Chiefs told him following consultation with the labs, that they could approve the reliability of U.S. nuclear weapons only from underground testing. They didn't need any other kind of testing. So, which meant also that the military would support the treaty in the Senate, in its ratification. So that's what happened in '63, and that started other limits on testing, which I'll get to next time. So I've zipped through a bunch of stuff. I hope you're catching it. I don't know. Turn it over to, any comments or questions before we shift? Okay, turn it over to Eric.
So Carl is in Korea, so I'm taking over for his fission lecture. I'll go through his slides to the best of my ability, and at the end, if we have extra time, we can do some work with the NSSC, and I can show you all how to access some nuclear data related to fission properties. So as Carl discussed, you have some particle on a fissile or fissionable nucleus on the energy of the particle, and that results in that nucleus splitting into two parts and emitting some number of neutrons. These neutrons then are able to go on and induce other reactions. So when you look at nuclear binding energy, this is the energy released as a result of the particles that make up the nucleus coming together. So you have two processes that can bring you closer to the maximum binding energy per nucleon. So this is a plot of binding energy per nucleon, and so the process of fusion takes you higher and higher in binding energy per nucleon until you reach the maximum point, and then you can think of, to some degree, as fission being a process that takes you in the other direction to this. Now, this plot is a little misleading because you can still push beyond iron 56, otherwise how would we even have nuclei that we fission in the first place? So you can still add particles to nuclei and continue to get a release in energy. However, the amount of energy released as you go further down this plot becomes less and less. So this plot is actually so you can continue to go beyond iron 56, but if you get to a high enough configuration and then you cause fission, that process drives you back down this binding energy. And so fission is a very energetic process. It's exothermic. Carl looked out the energy that's released per fission, and in general, rule of thumb is you get approximately 200 MeV of prompt energy. This chart lists fission product gamma rays. So those are gamma rays that come out from the fission products at a later time. And then he also lists neutrinos. That's not useful energy. You can't use that. But if you go to the IEA, they will give you a list of energy released per different nucleus at different neutron energies, and you'll find that for pretty much all of them, the prompt energy released is 200 MeV. You'll see in the homework, you calculate a Q value for fission, and you'll see it's about this value. So when fission happens, you don't get the same fragments each time. You get a distribution of fragments, and that the probability that you're going to get any one fragment is called a yield. And so that's the percent probability that you'll get that fragment. So here shows mass yields. Mass yields is the yield that you get per mass number A. So this is the probability that you get any nucleus with a number of nucleons. So you could have, for example, here is a matched chain, the matched chain 140. You could get xenon 140, you could get cesium 140, and so on. And the probability of getting something with mass 140 is called the mass yield. You can similarly get things called charge yield, but we don't usually talk about that. But that would be the probability that you get something with a particular proton number out of the fission process. And so we can measure with a pretty good degree of certainty mass yields, because all of these products, you might produce them and they'll have something like a 14-second half-life for xenon 40. So it's very hard to measure the yield directly to that product. So instead, what you can do is have your fission occur and then wait some long period of time, many half-lives after your longest lived species. So that's a variant 140 in this mass chain. So maybe you wait a year and you look and you do mass spectrometry and you see, okay, I've got this much % of cesium-140. And so that will give you an idea of what mass yield you get. In general, you're going to see that when you pause fission, you get an asymmetric curve in the mass chain and in the charge, or in terms of mass yields and in terms of charge yields. The reason that this is, as Carl was talking about, is certain nuclei are magic. They have additional stability for having a certain number of either protons or neutrons or both. So the fission yields, the heavy fragment of most nuclei that we deal with, there is a doubly magic nucleus right at the peak of this fission yield, and that's no coincidence. That's because that nucleus is more stable, and so the fission process likes to form nuclei around that region. And so if you were to look at your mass yield as a function of what mass of nuclei that you fission, you would see that as you increase your mass, so maybe you start with something like uranium-235, as you increase your mass, the heavy fragment yield bump stays pretty much in the same place, but then you get a slight shift over in your light fragment yield. And that's because, so if this is the 235 uranium chain and this is your 239 plutonium chain, now you've got 4 extra nucleons that you have to conserve. So the 2 isotopes that are most relevant to us in this class are the 2 that we use for nuclear energy generation or nuclear weapons. These are fissile isotopes. So there are 2 terms you need to keep in mind. There's fissile. That is a nucleus that can fission when a particle of essentially no energy incides on it. Or there's fissionable, which is a nucleus that can undergo fission, but you may need to bring in a particle with additional energy. So these 2 nuclei are fissile. They can fission with a thermal neutron. So that's a neutron that has almost negligible kinetic energy. It doesn't need to bring any additional energy because the fission barrier is already crossed by the release of energy from adding that nucleon to it. So there's uranium-235. It's a minority component of uranium-238. As Carl mentioned in class the other day, that's a pretty lucky thing, because if it were the majority of uranium, then we wouldn't have to enrich uranium. And you could just pull uranium out of the ground and use it for nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. There are 4 separation methods that are available. There's electromagnetic separation. So this is what Carl was talking about with cyclotrons in our last lecture, that if you take a fully stripped uranium and bend it through a magnetic field, you'll get a slight separation in the position at which it lands at the end of that magnetic field based on its mass. So the uranium will go through uranium-235 will go through a wider trajectory than the uranium-238 separated that way. There's gaseous diffusion, which I don't think we'll really talk about too much in this class. It was a short-lived, it was eventually replaced by centrifuge technology because that was much more efficient. So this is when you take your unenriched material, you place it in a gas, and then you put it inside of a large centrifuge, and you spin it around and get some sort of difference in the centrifugal force between molecules based on whether it has uranium-235 or uranium-238 molecule on it, and you're able to do a separation that way. And then there's laser isotopic separation. This has never really progressed past the research phase, and it's never been used, at least to my knowledge, for large-scale enrichment. And then we've got plutonium-239. This is another fissile isotope. So as we've discussed, there were two weapons that were used in World War II. There was one that was made of plutonium-239 and one made of uranium-235. So plutonium-239 is obtained by running a uranium reactor. And when neutrons capture on uranium-238, it produces uranium-239, which then quickly decays to neptunium-239, which decays to plutonium-239. So you get a secular equilibrium situation in your reactor where you're slowly building up your content of plutonium-239. And so that plutonium-239 can then be chemically separated from the uranium in your reactor. Something that I'm sure Carl will discuss later is that when you're doing that process of building up plutonium in your reactor, you have to limit how long you run the reactor for, because if you run it for too long, then the neutrons that are flying around your reactor that allow this production process also will destroy the plutonium-239 and produce plutonium-240, plutonium-241 by successive neutron captures on the plutonium-239. And that's an undesirable effect because the even plutoniums are not fissile, and they also have a larger spontaneous fission rate, and so those two effects do not make it a desirable isotope for use in weapons. And so you need to run your reactor only for long enough to get some amount of plutonium-239, but not so long that you get a buildup of plutonium-240 or 241. So we're going to talk about cross-sections. What is a nuclear reaction? I think we've been over this, but just to recap, a nuclear reaction is when you take any two nuclei and bring them together to form some other system. So here is an example of a fusion reaction. You take a deuterium nucleus, a tritium nucleus, bring them together, and this gets you a helium 4 nucleus, a neutron, and a release of 17.6 MeV of energy. In general, we do two-body reactions. I don't think I've ever heard of a three-body nuclear reaction, but it might be possible. So these are all some examples of reactions that you might get. A charged particle reaction, so this is a fusion reaction. You can have neutron capture, photodisintegration, so this allows for the generation of neutrons by placing gammas in the nuclear field. You can get elastic scattering, so this is when a particle comes in and it elastically scatters off of the nucleus, so this is like billiard balls. Or you can have inelastic scattering where the particle comes in, it interacts briefly with the nucleus, leaves some portion of its energy in the nucleus, and then scatters off. Oh, and as Carl says here, you have to conserve charge, total nucleon number, and energy and momentum. So long as you're abiding by these rules, you can get pretty much anything that you can imagine happening, so long as you conserve these quantities. So Carl, I think, wanted to talk here about why is it that we were so easily able to achieve nuclear energy with fission versus fusion. The time frame for getting to fission energy was relatively quick, whereas fusion, which we've been working on even longer, we're still not even close really to getting there. And so the difference between the two is nuclear fission energy uses neutrons. They have no charge, so they're able to easily move through matter without losing their energy. The problem with with fusion power is you're using charged particles and you need to fuse them together. So they have positive charge, both of them, and you need to bring them together, and charges that are similar repel each other. So one example of this is that people have talked about for many years in conspiracy theory and crackpot ways is aneutronic fusion. So that's proton plus boron, I believe it's boron 11, goes to carbon 12 and a gamma ray. So this would be an ideal nuclear reaction. It releases some amount of energy that's usable, and there is no radioactive byproduct. There's no neutron that goes on and makes radioactivity elsewhere, and you get a carbon 12, which is stable and not toxic. And so people have said, well, why don't you just take a block of boron and throw protons onto that and run water over the block and capture the energy and make your power that way. Well, the problem is you need to bring in the proton with some amount of energy high enough to overcome the Coulomb barrier of the boron 11. So you can't just throw in zero energy protons and expect to get fusion. But if you send in too much energy, you're just going to start wasting energy because you only get a few MeV out of the reaction. So you have to pick the perfect energy. But as you start sending in these protons, they have scattering with the electrons in the boron 11 matrix. And this is called, you can look at the Bethe-Bloch formula to get a sense of how much energy is lost by those electronic collisions as this charged particle moves through the matter. And so very quickly, just a few millimeters into this target, the proton will lose all of its energy and isn't able to continue forward and induce more reactions. So because you're dealing with charged particles, you can't easily facilitate this process. There have been a number of ways that have been researched to cause fusion. The two big ones are inertial confined fusion and magnetic confined fusion. So you have to squeeze these particles together to cause this reaction. One way you can do that is by placing them in a magnetic field, and another is similar to the way a detonation or implosion would work, where you use some sort of force to drive them into each other inertially. So one way you can do that is with lasers. That's what NIF down at Livermore does.
This is a really stupid question. Like, does it matter that charge isn't conserved in that reaction?
Well, charge is still conserved. I guess I just haven't written up this would be a hydrogen atom. So you would have to strip off the electron from the hydrogen and keep it somewhere else, but your net charge will be conserved. Yeah, thanks for stopping me on that. And so Carl took a little aside here to talk about nuclear reaction notation. So we write out nuclear reactions often like this and like I did up there. But if you go into nuclear databases and start looking for these reactions or go reading scientific papers, you'll rarely find the reaction written out like this. And so this notation is what you'll see. It's called reaction notation. And the thing that is your target is on the left-hand side, outside of the parentheses. You take your projectile and put it on the left-hand side in the parentheses, comma, whatever comes out, close parentheses, and on the right is your residual. The residual is usually the heavy thing. So people do like to think of this as heavy thing, light thing in, light thing out, heavy thing. But that's not always the case. So there are things called inverse kinematics where you might actually have a target, a deuterium target, and you run krypton into it because krypton is a noble gas. You can't easily make a solid target with it. So it's somewhat of a nuance, but it's important to remember that it's target, not just whatever is heavy. So then Carl does an exercise here where we talk about how can you measure the diameter of a bowling ball without a ruler. And he offers this example where we put a large number of bowling balls evenly distributed or randomly distributed in a haystack. Another way that you can think of this is, and the reason we're doing this is this gives us a good handle of how cross-sections work and how they're measured. So another way of thinking is that you can take a square and place a circle inside of it. And how would you, without making any measurement of this, figure out what is the area of this circle. And so what you can do is you can start randomly dropping points onto this figure. And you'll eventually get an even distribution of points throughout the figure, and count up the number of points that land within the circle versus the number of points that land outside of the circle but still within the square. And you can come up with an analytical form based on the area of a square to the area of a circle with the same radius, and figure out, based on the ratio you measure, what the area of the circle and the square must be. So that's essentially what we're going for here. If you were to distribute some set of objects in a plane that have some area and start throwing some evenly distributed particle in to sense where those particles were, you can get a measurement of the net area of each of those individual particles. So if you were to take this plane and put it on its side and start to throw in neutrons or protons or whatever particle you want to measure, you would have some that would go right through without ever interacting with any of the particles of interest. You'd have some that hit and scatter. You'd have some that hit and absorb. And so you can measure the number of particles that make it through on the other side without an interaction. And you can determine the number of scatters you get is based on the number of particles you put in times the areal density of your particles in the medium times the cross-section. So if you know this density going in and you know the number of particles you put in, you can get the cross-sectional area. That is the area of each of these in 2 dimensions doing that method. And the units that we use in nuclear for cross-section, so the cross-section of a nucleus is the barn. And this, I guess, has some sort of historical use from the Manhattan Project, that something about throwing in a particle in it. Carl would love to share that. So you can look at cross-sections on different nuclei for neutrons as a function of energy groups. So here we have fast neutrons. These are neutrons that are moving with several MeV of kinetic energy. And you can then look at, well, what happens if I slow this neutron down and send it in? So this is thermal. Thermal being defined as a distribution, a black body distribution like you would have in a room. So the room temperature, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the neutrons scatter around until they only have the kinetic energy that the particles in them have. And so you can, and then there's well thermal. This is an even further thermalized energy. So for a number of actinides here that we have that are fissile, you can see that for thermal neutrons, there's a rather large cross-section for these nuclei, for those types of, for those energies of neutrons. And you'll notice here that the scale is log scale. So the cross-section for these fast neutrons is significantly less than it is. And you can think, well, why might that be? It's because the particle is moving through. It's like a plane wave, and it has more time to interact with the nucleus if it's moving by slowly than it would if it was moving by quickly. And you can get these cross-sections for really any nucleus that is sufficiently stable to make a target of it and measure its cross-section. And so we'll go over to the NMDC and I can show you how you can look up some of these cross-sections, but here's a table of a few of them for some common materials that you might see in a nuclear reactor. So this is the total thermal neutron cross-section. And so for something like carbon, you might have a graphite moderated reactor. You can see that the carbon medium that you would put around uranium is very lowly absorptive of those thermal neutrons. But the uranium itself, or the plutonium that you also have building up in the reactor, really want to absorb those neutrons. And there's different nuclear physics reasons for why that is. And then you have some problematic or maybe useful nuclei that have very large capture cross sections, even larger than the fissile material that you're trying to cause fission on. So that could be a problem like xenon 135, where it has this 2 million barn cross section, and that's a fission product. So as you're producing, as you're causing fission, you're producing a nucleus that has a very large cross section just sitting around now amongst your uranium, absorbing neutrons that you would rather have going on to produce chain reaction and continue the chain reaction. Or you have something like boron that isn't produced by fission, but you need something to capture neutrons and slow the fission process down, otherwise you would get a runaway chain reaction. So you can use something like boron to produce a control rod to absorb neutrons and slow down reaction. So Carl has a video for us to watch that demonstrates what happens to thermal neutrons in the presence of a nucleus that has a very large cross-section for thermal neutrons. There's a lot. I'll just turn it up there.
Helium-3 gas in a proportional tube. And this electronics over here is counting the response of that tube to neutrons. Here we see the meter showing about 15 neutrons per second, or about halfway up the scale. As I've noted in the previous video, the neutron source of use here is a fast neutron source comprised of americium in close contact with beryllium. And it releases neutrons with a mean energy of about 4 MeV. On contrast, or with, in contrast to that, the detector tube mostly detects slow neutrons that have been moderated in the plastic and reflected back into the tube.
So real quick, what he's saying here is the neutron source he has produces fast neutrons. So to see this effect of thermal neutron capture, he needs to slow them down. So he has this plastic round. The reason he uses plastic is because it has a lot of hydrogen atoms within that medium, and hydrogen is very good for slowing down neutrons. They hit those hydrogen atoms, or it's just a proton, and a large amount of energy is lost by the hydrogen in that event. And so just a few events, a few scatters within this plastic will bring the neutron from having an energy of several MeV down to only EV or even fractions of an EV.
Now we're going to place a piece of cadmium, which is a very strong absorber of slow neutrons, around the proportional counter. You will see how that impacts the counter. First, I'll take this piece of plastic out, and then I'll temporarily remove the fast neutron source. Get some tape around it. I'll place the cadmium sleeve onto the tube. And I will replace the neutron source. And a piece of plastic. Now let's take a look at our count rate. It's taken a serious hit from the cadmium attenuation. It used to be up there halfway up the scale of 50 per second. Now it's barely at 10 per second. So more than 3/4 of our neutron flux, our low energy neutron flux that had been making it into the tube, is now being eaten up by the cadmium. Let's try a somewhat different experiment. going to take the cadmium sleeve off the tube. In this experiment, I'm going to place the neutron source into a cadmium sleeve. Like that. Now I'll place the cadmium covered source on the tube, and I'll replace the piece of plastic. And we will see what this has done to our neutron count rate. We used to be halfway up the scale, almost 50 counts per second before beginning this experiment. Now, we're almost at 40 counts per second, or almost only 1/5 of where we were when we had no cadmium whatsoever here. So in contrast to the previous experiment, where the cadmium sleeve covered the tube and attenuated 4/5 of our neutron flux getting into the tube, now we are putting the cadmium around the fast neutron source, and the neutrons, the high energies have no trouble getting through the cadmium. They are being moderated and reflected back into the detector by the surrounding plastic.
So this video shows an example of how you can use these high cross-section materials to develop your nuclear system and make it do things you want. The placement of them is very important for how you capture, moderate your neutrons. And so here Carl shows the cross-section of cadmium, the main cadmium isotope, as a function of incident neutron energy. So you see that up here at around 1 MeV, or 4 MeV, because this is a log scale, at the energy where the neutrons are being emitted by the source that he had, the cross-section is only about a bar. So it doesn't do much to absorb those neutrons. But as they scatter through the paraffin that he has around and come back towards the detector, they go down to an energy of a few eV. And so now you're down in this range here, where now your cross-section is 4 or 5 orders of magnitude larger than it was before. So when you only cover the source with the cadmium, you're not doing a very good job of absorbing those neutrons, and they're able to get out of the source and then scatter in the paraffin and go back to the detector. But when you put the cadmium instead around the detector, you're allowing the neutrons to go into the paraffin, and as they come back towards the detector, now they have a lower energy where they have a much higher cross-section and don't cause a significant array in the detector. So I guess we'll talk about fission cross-sections. You can see here is a plot of uranium-235, plutonium-239, and uranium-238's fission cross-sections. So at low energies, thermal energies, you have a very high cross-section for these neutrons. For uranium-235 and plutonium-239, because these are fissile isotopes. However, if you look at uranium-238, which is not fissile, it's fissionable but not fissile, it doesn't start to have a significant fission cross-section until you've passed about an MeV. So you need to have fast neutrons to cause fission in non-fissile isotopes.
Wait, what was that resonance region? This I don't.
Oh, sure. So this is the resonance region. When you change your neutron energy as you're moving through, your cross-section changes because there are levels in the compound nucleus that you can populate by the capture of this neutron. So if you were to look at a level scheme of uranium, or of the compound nucleus that you're producing for any of these reactions, you've got some number of levels that are distributed. And if you were then look at on another axis, the cross-section, you would see that when the energy of your neutron corresponds to the Q value of that capture, your cross section goes up, and then as it passes that, resonance goes back down, goes back up, and so you get very fine energy windows where you actually have a very large cross section because you're capturing into a specific state. And so this energy region spans from about a keV to about an MeV. And so Carl's last slide, I think his purpose here is that your total cross-section is the sum of all the different reaction types you can have. And for any individual event where you send in a particle, it can do any one of these things. And the probability that it does one of those things is its cross-section of that interaction relative to the total cross-section. So you're not just going to be able to say, I'm going to send in a neutron and it is going to do a fission. You have to account for the fact that it can do any of these things, and the cross-sections give you the probability of those reactions occurring. So I think that takes us right up till the end.
Questions, comments? Further thoughts? Okay, I'll see you on Wednesday.
One time.
And so-